Talk to us about the airstrikes this morning and yesterday that hit the refugee camp. The goal there obviously was targeting Hamas militants, but you can't help but think about civilian casualties, that we don't quite hear those exact numbers when things like this happen. What do you say to the many voices that will no doubt point to this as another example of the IDF's attack on all of Gaza, even the innocent Palestinian people?
Well, look, I mean, there's some hard questions that have to be answered. And I mean, you can see from the video you just showed prior to that, I mean, there was a whole section of that part of the city that was just utterly flattened, 20 buildings, I think your correspondent said there. And there's an issue with a legitimate military target, and then there's an issue with taking care of civilians. And the laws of war do allow you to, in certain circumstances, to strike buildings if militants are using them for defensive purposes. But there is also the issue of you can't just wantonly strike civilians in the process. Just because they're there, they don't get to be killed. And when you're talking, there's probably hundreds of people that were in there. And the problem for Israel is not just the rules of engagement issue, but it's also their support in the West. And it's already starting to erode. And this is something that the IDF leadership is going to have to come to grapple with, because if these kinds of images keep getting out there and you get more and more protests in the West, and it undermines the support for the IDF. And look, they haven't even gone into the major parts of Gaza City yet. Much more is probably still to come. And if Israel loses its support in the West, it could have a really negative impact on their ability to even continue the war.
That is such an extraordinarily important point, and thank you for making it. I want to stick with that, because the support from the West is critical. During more peaceful times, America gives $4 billion a year to Israel, that Iron Dome that is so wildly successful. We've helped pay for that. And they are our strongest ally in that part of the world. You are, though, and this has been reported, seeing a shift in the language a little bit that the White House is using, getting a little more worried about how Israel is proceeding here. And we're not even to the entree part of the meal. We're still in the appetizer stage of this thing, right. And now we're looking at already the kind of carnage that's unfolding at these two refugee camps. But at the end of the day, it's hard to imagine anything breaking the American-Israeli all the ties that bind us. But talk more about the idea that if not just the West saying, whoa, this is too much for us, but then the idea that it expands the conflict as these kind of images go around the world and inflame Arabs around the world.
Right. That's so crucial. I'm glad you went down that direction, because look, first of all, there's just the moral component of it. When Israel tells the Palestinian people to leave areas because they're going to be targeted, and so they go to refugee camps, and then that camp is hit, I mean, that puts Israel in a really bad light. And of course, it's already starting to cause problems, as I said, in the West. But then in the Arab countries, it's starting to really inflame. I mean, we had last weekend over 1 million people protesting in Turkey. It was said that the Erdogan really reinforced that and said yesterday, we may actually go to war with Israel if this doesn't stop. And on the more narrow, or the closest one in Hezbollah, the Nasrallah, the leader of the Hezbollah in Lebanon, is going to have a major speech on November 3rd, just a couple of days from now. And some say that he made a speech like that before the 2006 war with Israel. So something more could be coming there, and there are real issues here.
We spoke with someone earlier this morning who worked for the IDF International Legal Department for 20 years, and she painted the picture of, okay, what exactly would you guys do? And, you know, if we don't do this, if we don't have this ground invasion, if we don't do what they believe they're supposed to do, then you have Hezbollah, you have Iran, you have all of these other actors that you were just talking about that say, okay, there is weakness there. But when it comes to international law and rules of war, you know, when you think of war, you don't think of rules to abide by, obviously, right? But legally speaking here, though, it's getting a little treacherous at this point, would you say?
Look, there are rules, there are laws that you have to follow if you want to have a chance to succeed in war. The reason those laws of war exist is as much to protect your side as it is just to follow the human norms of engagement. Everybody understands sometimes wars have to come, but you have to protect the civil population. And yeah, to answer your question there, that will make it much more difficult on the IDF to conduct their operations if they have to take care of these people. But the fact that they are there, you don't just get to say, well, we want to go after Hamas, so we're going to kill everybody in the way, because that violates the laws of land warfare, because that's not taking care of the civil population. Because if we don't do it here, if we don't require or at least insist that Israel do more, follow the laws of land warfare, how are we going to tell anyone else in the world, Russia, when they're attacking civilians in Ukraine? On what moral grounds can we claim someone else has to follow it when our allies won't? That's one of the secondary problems this is causing the United States. Even if we back Israel unconditionally and they violate these laws, then that casts negative light on us and puts us at potential risk. But most importantly, it harms the civilians who have no play in this, and there's nowhere they can go. And if we're not going to help take care of them, who will?
And correct me if I'm wrong, Rob, but when Russia shut off electricity to Ukraine, there was immense outrage about that.
Exactly.
We're talking about lack of food, water, electricity.
People have pointed out a dichotomy between what we're willing to accept in the Ukraine situation, Israel, and how they're divergent, and some people are seeing a little bit of hypocrisy there. I don't want to let you go without addressing what was arguably the top headline in our country yesterday, and that was Christopher Wray being very blunt during a congressional hearing, saying, listen, what's going on in Israel right now could very much turn into attacks here at home. As always, the number one concern being lone wolf attacks, people that are watching the news, seeing what's happening, and then deciding to act out here, primarily because, of course, we are such strong allies of Israel's, and they're watching what is unfolding in this conflict. Talk a little bit about the threat in our borders, regardless of what's happening overseas. Talk about that threat, because he had quite the warning yesterday.
Yeah, I actually had a conversation yesterday with former U.S. Ambassador to Saudi Arabia, Chaz Freeman, who has a significant concern in that regard, because he's saying, yeah, there's a humanitarian issue and the laws of war about how Israel's killing lots of civilians, but this has a bigger impact because we give endorsement to that, or at least support it, or don't say anything about it. Then that's going to cause other people who have a hatred of the Jews everywhere around the world to say, well, we can't go after the U.S., but we can go after this soft target here. Within our own borders, you have, obviously, there's a lot of anti-Semitism that it had already existed. This is exacerbating it. But then you also have anti-Muslim, anti-Israeli, anti-Palestinian, because there's different groups in different places. And you see that all of those are being attacked because of all the chaos that's going on in Israel. And this is something that's going to be a problem that we're going to have to face for probably as long as this war is going on.
And we all know it doesn't take much for someone to become radicalized, particularly in a country with a mental health epidemic that we've seen, and in a country that had that awful synagogue attack just a few years ago in the Pittsburgh area. And now here we are. Retired Army Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis, thank you for one of the most clarifying and perspective-rich interviews we've done on this show about this conflict. I sincerely thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.